Hey everyone, it's Megan with Fiveable. I'm here tonight to go over AP Psychology, our development unit, Psychosocial, Gender, and Sexuality Development. It's also an exciting night because it's election night, which I'm super excited about. Hopefully all of you, if you are old enough, got out today and voted. If you didn't, there's still time, or tell your parents to get out and vote because it's important. It's our civic duty, so make sure you guys take care of that as well. You can always catch the replay here on this. But so for content tonight, like I said, we're going to cover development, which is psychosocial, gender, and sexuality. Next week, we're going to take a little break from like new content stuff, and I'm just going to cover a wide range of psychological misconceptions. We're going to talk about hypnosis and lie detector tests and maybe some astrology and things like that. And I'm also going to throw in a little bit of review from the development unit, just because both sessions for development are going to be a little bit long and we're not going to get a lot of review time in. So instead, I'm going to throw that review to next week, and then we'll also cover those psychological misconceptions as well. And then the last unit before we start winter break is going to be the learning unit. We'll have 2 weeks on that, and then we'll do some review if you guys have semester exams coming up. So lots of review opportunities coming your way. So just as a recap, if you weren't here last week, the development unit focuses on how we change all the way from like prenatal development, so in the womb, up through the time that we die. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about development, you think like, oh, well, once you're an adult, you're fully developed. But in psychology, that's not the case. Like, we study all of the changes that occur across the entire lifespan. And so it's important that we don't just talk baby, toddler type development, but all the way through death and dying. This unit is about 7 to 9% of the AP exam, so it's a bigger unit. And then, like I've mentioned before, we cover cognitive and social and moral and all of these different phases of development. So today we're going to start with talking about psychosocial development. And Erikson, should be easy to remember, Erikson, is the main psychologist who's going to discuss psychosocial development. And so if you look at how that word breaks down, psychosocial, so there's a psychological component to this development, and then there's also the social component. So there's kind of two factors in Erikson's theories about development. And so what Erikson says is that in each stage of development, we have a certain task or crisis that needs to be met or resolved. And if we successfully meet that task or meet that requirement, we can then successfully move forward to the next stage of development. If we don't meet that, then there may be like developmental problems or other issues then that linger on later into our lifespan. So basically, he kind of says, you'll see how they're set up, but we can go one of two ways in our development because each stage has a this or a that. And so we'll see that as we progress. Before we get, though, into his specific stages, I do want to talk a little bit about prenatal development. It just kind of fits in here because we're going to talk about gender. And so as we go through the ages, prenatal is like the earliest age, right? So we're just going to start here. So prenatal sexual development. Now, this is not specifically tied to Erikson. This is just general information that you need to know. And so our sexual development occurs prenatally based on the chromosomes that we get. The Y chromosome is what makes you male or not, and you get that from your father. And so you just kind of need to know that. And that's just talking about biological sex. Another important hormone in prenatal sexual development is testosterone. And it's the most important male sex hormone. And this is a tricky thing that sometimes people get tripped on. Both genders have testosterone. Both males and females have testosterone. It's just that guys have a lot more of it. So don't get tricked on a question like if they ask about testosterone and assume it's only about males, because both genders have it. Males just have more of it. And then in prenatal sexual development, around the 4th or 5th month of development, the sex hormones really start to influence how the brain is wired. And so there are, when we start talking about gender differences, certain ways that the brain looks a little bit differently or is wired a little bit differently for males or for females. And so there are some nature and some nurture aspects to gender differences. And some of the nature impacts already take place in the prenatal development and how our brains are wired and formed. So just a little like prenatal development, this is going to lead us through, I'm going to weave in the gender development stuff as we go. So Erikson, now back to Erik Erikson, psychosocial development. His first stage that he talks about is trust versus mistrust. And this is from infancy, so the time that you're born, up to about age 1. And basically, when an infant's needs are met, they develop a basic sense of trust. So are they fed on time? Do they get their diaper changed in a timely manner? Are they given love and attention? Just kind of like basic needs that a baby needs to be met. If those things happen, then that infant feels like they can trust the world. They've developed a sense that the world is fair, that they'll be taken care of, it's not scary, and it's not dangerous. If they don't have those needs met, we may see later on issues with attachment, which we talked about last time with Mary Ainsworth and her situation with attachment. We may see not having like proper development with like your caregivers and things like that. So we obviously want to develop the trusting relationship for that infant. As the infant then moves past age 1, then they shift into this next stage of development. And these aren't like rigid stages. It's a continuum, right, of things that are happening. And so these ages are all approximate. It's not like a rigid structure. So from around age 1 to around age 3, the next stage of development for psychosocial tasks is autonomy versus shame. And so this is when little kids start to realize that they can do things for themselves. Like, not a lot, right? Like a 2-year-old can't do a lot for itself, but they start to realize that like, it's not just my caregiver. I can pick up a sippy cup and put it in my mouth and do these different things and start to do things on their own. And so really as through toddlerhood, children start to exercise their free will. They do things for themselves and they develop these sort of abilities. If they're not allowed to develop any sort of autonomy or their own kind of abilities, then they may end up being doubtful that they are capable of doing things. And this would then further impact them in the future about whether or not they're able to, do any sort of tasks, or do they become solely reliant on like a caregiver and they're unable to really do anything on their own. So we want kids to develop a sense of who they are and their abilities with autonomy, things like that. All right, next stage then of development is initiative versus guilt. And this occurs from about age 3 to about age 6. And in this stage, the whole task is then about, can you start something on your own and carry out those plans? And so this picture here, the sandcastle picture, I think is a good example of this. Like a little kid decides, I'm going to build a sandcastle, and they put all these different things together, carry out the tasks, and they build it and do it on their own. That's a great example of initiative, like a planning process from start to finish that a little kid could do. If they aren't successful in this phase of development, Erik Erikson would say that they might feel guilty about their efforts to be independent and then kind of, again, go back to that reliance on whoever their caregiver is in that scenario. So autonomy and initiative are kind of similar. Autonomy is more about like, can you just do anything on your own? Whereas initiative is like kind of taking the lead on something and then continuing forward with it. So that's how I would differentiate those two, because they are sort of similar. Again, as I'm going through these, if you have any questions, you can either just throw them in the chat or you throw them in the ask a question box, either way. So now we're going to take a little side step here. We're on Erikson's third stage of development, and we're going to start talking a little bit more about gender development. So we're not necessarily talking just about Erikson here. We're just talking about gender in general. And the reason I did my little segue here is because this age range 3 to 6 is when we really start to see more gendered kind of development in kids with like boys do this, girls do that, that sort of idea. And so I think it's a good time to talk about gender in this age range. So first and foremost, it's important to understand that gender is socially constructed, meaning the only reason my body parts or my biological gender have any meaning is because society has determined that that has meaning. So Race is another example of this, like your skin color, things like that, don't have any meaning except for the fact that the society has decided that that has meaning. And so the reason why gender is such a powerful thing is because society has given those ideals certain meanings, and it really depends where you live too, right? In some societies that are extremely conservative, women are required to cover up and things like that. And so it could be a whole other discussion. If you are interested in that, sociology would be a great class for you. But the human mind is really interested in categorizing things. And we talked a little bit about this last time, how little kids create schemas of things like dog and cat. Well, it's the same thing with like gender. Having an easy way to just look at someone and say, oh, male, oh, female. It's just our mind likes to categorize things, put them in groups. It helps us understand the world a lot easier. And so one of the most easy, typically, ways to do that is through gender. And why we care about gender in psychology is because it influences our social development. There's clearly like toys and things marketed for little girls and toys and things marketed for little boys. Pink clothes for girls, blue clothes for boys, trucks for boys, dolls for girls. And so those social influences develop who we are and how we think and how we interact with the world. And so we really are, as psychologists, interested in gender because the roles that gender plays in development can have a powerful impact then on how we see ourselves in the world and how we interact with the world. And then here I just have the genderbread person. I don't know if you've seen this before, but sometimes it can be confusing when we talk about gender identity, which is how you identify yourself, like how you think about yourself. Are you more male or female? Your gender expression, so how do you express gender in a more masculine way or in a more feminine way? And then biological sex refers to the parts that you were born with biologically. And then sexual orientation then is who like you're interested in sexually. So just I think that might be useful because sometimes gender identity, expression, all those terms can be confusing. But continuing on with gender then, there's some typical traits or things that we see in gender that we typically talk about. And so in psychology, one of the things we talk about is aggression and the different traits that exist for the genders. And so for females, we would say that women are more likely to create relational acts of aggression, meaning like, I'm going to talk about Susie behind her back because she's a real B word, you know, things like that. So girls are more into like the gossipy kind of aggression. And this is, again, typically speaking, and it's not necessarily, it's not true all of the time. And also a lot of these gender norms are shifting in our society. So just keep in mind that this is kind of a historical viewpoint. These things are shifting over time, but we still need to talk about them and study them as psychologists understand them today. Men, on the other hand, are more likely to actually commit physical acts of aggression, hitting someone, pushing someone, hurting someone. And if we look at like arrest rates for violent crimes, men have just extremely higher rates of violence, like murder and things like that, than women do. And so it's clearly, we could talk about whether that has to do with like a biological factor, like are there certain reasons why men are wired a certain way to be more violent, or is it how society teaches boys that they have to be tough and aggressive and they can't cry and things like that? And so psychology is interested in that, those like differences. What's causing it? Is there a biological factor, or is there factors in our social environment that are causing these issues? Gender and social power is also really important, especially with the election tonight. I think we see in politics typically a lot more men involved. And so when we look at social power and how we gauge men and women, women tend to be more democratic in nature. So even think about like in a group project that you've been in. If you're female, you've maybe been more into like hearing everyone's opinion and getting input from all over, versus like maybe there's a guy who just takes charge and says, you do this, you do that. Women also tend to be more supportive. They tend to smile more, and they tend to apologize more. This is something I'm really working on myself personally. I'm just always saying I'm sorry, and it's just like I was like programmed to do that from like early on. And so I'm just trying to apologize less. It's just something like personally I'm working on. In politics with social power, we see women often judged by how they look. The two links there are just interesting stories. I'm going to see if I can get these to pop up. Let me see. I'm not sure if you guys can see. No, it's not coming up for you guys, is it? Okay. Well, the two stories about Chancellor Angela Merkel from Germany, and then from when Hillary Clinton was running for office recently. And so what they just talk about is not politics, but how they look, how they're dressed, things like that. And so they're judging the women's like political power and advocacy just based on how they look. Typically, we wouldn't see that with a man as much. And so it's just another example of like gender differences in social power. Men then tend to be more direct in their power. They tend to have more opinions, smile less, and apologize less as well. For social connectedness, again, these are just on average, typically speaking, women tend to be more interdependent. So like with like a small group of friends, and more communicative. Women spend more time on the phones, write longer emails, and are more emotive and more expressive in their behaviors. And men tend to be more like kind of surface level. Like they may have a larger friend group, but it's more like based in like large group activities and large group settings with more activities and more competition, whereas women may tend to have a smaller group, but more like tight group of friends, things like that. All right, so gender and culture is important. So I touched on this a little bit before, but our culture is like our shared group kind of norms and ideas, and then we pass them down from generation to generation. And so gender roles in our culture are very different than gender roles in Saudi Arabia. Women in Saudi Arabia often have to be completely covered from head to toe. I believe they just won the right to drive vehicles, things like that. And so in the United States, we might think that that's completely off base and completely like not okay, but that's how gender roles in their country function. And so when we talk about gender, we can't just talk about it in like a global view because it's so different across cultures. So it's really important for us to kind of think about our own culture and specific roles that we're discussing. Sorry. And another interesting thing is that nomadic cultures, so cultures that are based around like moving and not permanent settlements, tend to have less rigid or less strict gender roles. And if you think about it, historically, that would make sense because if everyone has to continually be on the move for hunting and gathering and things like that, it would make sense that everyone has to participate, and then there's less structured like at-home duties for like a wife and then like outside of the house duties for a man. So just understanding that gender is influenced by culture because it is socially constructed, and then they do change over time, like our roles and our ideas. And so there's two big ways then that we learn like how to be male or how to be female. And you kind of have to understand these theories. Social learning theory states that we learn from basically society what that means. So at a very early age, even without, it doesn't mean that someone is explicitly telling you boys do this and girls do that, but we learn from observing. So if your mom is the primary, like a stay-at-home mom, and you see her doing cooking and cleaning and things like that, you may start to associate that with like the female gender. Or if you watch TV and on TV there's ads for Barbie dolls and the Barbies are only being played with by little girls, and then there's a truck ad and all of the little boys are playing with the truck. So we're learning through observing our society, what's going on, what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. So social learning, we're learning kind of through the observing society. Gender schema then, if you think back, we talked about schema last time. Gender schema then basically says that we build this idea then we take like a concept like boy, and then we start to add parts to it. So boy means blue. I'm just going to say some really stereotypical things. Boy means blue. Boy means trucks. And we start to build this schema or this understanding of what each gender means. And so gender schema and social learning aren't like exclusive. They kind of work together, if that makes sense. All right, so now we're moving back into Erikson's stages. So he again, remember, is psychosocial development. So his next stage now is kind of a broad stage. So we're talking age 6 to puberty. And so puberty really is dependent on biological factors and could happen at different times for different people. And so during this stage of development, children learn the pleasure of applying themselves to a task. So this is where you might find things that you are really good at or things that you really enjoy doing. You become competent, hopefully, at something, whether it's a sport or an instrument or a hobby or just something that makes you feel good, like you could be successful at it. If you don't find this thing that makes you feel competent, you then would feel the opposite of that, which is inferior. That's not good. We don't want that to happen. And so we have to let kids develop things that they can experience basically success with. And if we look at social development a little bit, we can see that this is kind of the stage as we get older where we start to have less positive interactions with our parents. And so you can kind of think about this is where like that independence really starts to take hold. And excuse me, we see kids kind of pushing the boundaries and wanting to do their own thing kind of from their parents. And that kind of makes sense. If they're becoming competent, capable human beings, they then probably are starting to push back a little bit from feeling like they need their parents involved. And so again, we're going to kind of stray off of Erikson for a little bit and talk about this adolescent time period because it's kind of covered in his stage of inferiority or competence. And so adolescence is just our transition period that lasts from childhood through adulthood, about puberty to independence. And so it's kind of tied in with Erikson's stage here. And so continuing to talk about that, in adolescence, our physical development, puberty, which was just mentioned in Erikson's stage, is the time that we mature sexually. And so the sequence of these events is more predictable than the timing. Puberty is starting earlier and earlier in our culture, 11, 12, 10. And so the timing we can't really predict, but we can say like certain things are going to happen in a certain order. And I just really like these two pictures here. The reason I chose them, this was my date freshman year to a high school dance. That's in the upper right-hand corner. And then that's the same person 4 years later when we were seniors in high school. He's a good friend of mine. And so you can see that puberty happened at very different stages for us. He had probably maybe just entered puberty or not even entered puberty yet in that picture. He hadn't hit his growth spurt yet, lots of different things. And then the difference, 4 years makes. So I just think it's an interesting example of adolescence and how the timing of that can differ. But when we do hit puberty, brain pruning also occurs. And what that means is that basically our brain takes, like if you're pruning a tree, right, you cut off things that are like dead or not being used. That's kind of what our brain does. It starts to like refine itself, and basically like things that aren't being used get kind of thrown away. Things that are being used get like pruned up and made to look nice and to work better. And so our brain really starts to specialize and become good at the different things that it needs to become good at. Our frontal lobe in this time period is still developing too. And so when we see things like teenagers die in car accidents at a much higher rate than like at higher rates than other age groups, part of that has to do with your lack of frontal lobe development. You don't always think through the decisions you make. And it's not because you're dumb, right? That has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the fact that your brain isn't fully developed yet, and you just really sometimes can't think through the consequences of your actions. And so it's just something important for you guys to know and to think about since you are teenagers and you fall into this age range. This is the time we're also going to talk about sexual orientation, because I think this is when people start to have their first boyfriends and girlfriends and things like that. So I think it just fits into this category. And so again, this isn't anything tied specifically to Erikson. It's just tied to the kind of age range that we're talking about. And so according to studies, about 3% of men and 1 to 2% of women identify as homosexual. And so one important thing is that most psychologists, like almost all psychologists in all literature that you're going to read, agree that sexual orientation is not chosen and cannot willfully be changed. And so when we see people sent to like camps to like convert them from not being gay and things like that. Those are like really frowned upon in the psychological community because it's just not believed that that's something that would work, and not something that like would be in any way like useful. But what is interesting is if you study historically speaking, being homosexual used to be considered like a disorder. So if people were gay, they would say like they would try and treat it because it was seen as like a mental disorder at the time. It was listed in the DSM. So the DSM is like the Diagnostic Statistician's Manual. And it's basically this big book of all kinds of different psychological disorders. And like it talks about what those disorders are. And so this being homosexual or being gay was listed in this book. And so we can see why even today, the 70s weren't that long ago, why some people still look upon being gay in a certain way, because that's how it was when they were younger, and that's how it used to be treated as such. And so, things are changing, but it is still something that sometimes people maybe frown upon or treat in a certain way. And so hopefully that's shifting or changing now. We also know that people who identify as LGBTQ plus have higher rates of depression and suicide. And so whether that has to do with something biological in their brain or the fact that they experience much higher rates of bullying, parental alienation, and things like that, that also can play a role in that. And so those are really big risk factors that like we should look out for and be aware of in our, LGBT friends and things like that. Environment and sexual orientation. So basically like looking at why are some people gay and why are some people straight. Psychologists, that's something we study, like why some people have these differing orientations. And so basically from all the studies that have been done, and there's been a lot of studies done on this, but it doesn't appear that there's any sort of environmental factor that influences sexual orientation. If there is, we haven't discovered what it is yet. But basically, so like having two gay dads or having two gay moms or having a single mom or a single dad or anything like that, none of that appears to play any sort of role in a child's sexual orientation. There's been lots of studies about like gay adoption and things like that. Nothing like that seems to be linked to a child's then later sexual orientation. We do have some studies, though, that relate some biological factors to sexual orientation. These are all theories, so none of these are like proven for a fact, but there are some evidence to maybe back up some of their relevance. So the first kind of just evidence that supports a biological theory towards sexual attraction or same-sex orientation is that many other species in the animal world also show same-sex attraction. So swans, I think dolphins, penguins, there's a lot of animals that also have same-sex couples. And so if it was like strictly a human thing, but because we see it in other species, we know that there maybe are biological factors at play. Studies also have shown that there are some brain differences between hetero and homosexual people, particularly in the hypothalamus region. Not necessarily, we don't know why or what that means yet, but we have seen some small differences in the brain. So maybe there's a biological factor there. Evidence of like a gay gene, I don't know. That's some unclear results. There's no like, we can't just look at like a specific gene and say, yep, this person's going to grow up to have a heterosexual identity. This person's going to have a homosexual identity. We aren't like that. We don't have things like that. And then an interesting thing is that identical twins are slightly more likely to share a sexual orientation than fraternal twins. So again, there may be some sort of biological factor at play. Couple of other theories. In studies of sheep, high levels of testosterone were also linked to same-sex attraction. So perhaps when the baby is in the womb, if it's exposed to a higher level of testosterone, then that could influence the sexual orientation. And then lastly, there's some theories about birth order and the mother's immune system. You probably don't have to know any of those like individual theories, but the big takeaway here, the huge thing that you have to know and have to understand is that these are all hypotheses. We aren't sure what leads to the differences in sexual orientation, but we are very strongly leaning towards biological factors. We're trying to discover what it is. It's probably not environmental. It's probably biological. So just kind of, that's your takeaway there. All right. Cognitive development then in adolescence. So we're still in this kind of like puberty phase, timeline, whatever you want to call it. At this time, we really start to like think about what others think about us. And so we get into this like, no one else understands me, like no one knows what I'm going through, you wouldn't understand, that sort of phrase, because we feel so unique and alone in our development. And then we also become like hyper concerned and hyper aware of others' perception of us. And so we feel like, oh my gosh, everyone's judging us. And we have this idea of like the spotlight effect, that like everyone sees and notices everything that we do and we're being judged and being critical of. In reality, that's not the case, but that's just like how your brain is processing information of that time. But we also have some really cool things that we develop in adolescence, and we can be abstract thinkers and critical thinkers and really start to understand the world around us and take an interest in society and social issues and things like that. So it's kind of a hard time, because at one hand we're so focused on ourselves and on our development, but with our like new abstract thought processes, we also have the whole world to kind of think about and consider. And so it's a really unique time period. We're going to continue now talking a little bit about moral development. And so this person's name is Kohlberg, Lawrence Kohlberg. You do need to know this name. He appears quite often on the AP test. And he has this idea of moral development. And I'm throwing it in here in this kind of post-puberty stage, because I think that's when we start to have our more abstract thinking going on. And so we can make more moral or more informed decisions. And basically, Kohlberg says that as moral development progresses, our focus removes like from ourselves to like society and like the greater good as a whole. And so, which kind of makes sense, right? When you're a little kid, you're just worried about like being punished or not. But like I just mentioned, as we grow in adolescence, we start to have a greater concern for those around us. And so Kohlberg has this like ladder of stages of moral development. There's 3 main stages: pre-conventional, which is the earliest, most basic stage; conventional; and then post-conventional. And there's not necessarily specific ages associated with this, but more of like tasks or things that happen. And so what's important to know, and this is the tricky part about Kohlberg's ladder, so you definitely want to pay attention to this. The tricky part is that what doesn't matter, the choice that you make in a moral situation doesn't matter. What matters is the reason why you make that choice. So according to Kohlberg, we can determine your level of moral development based on your reasoning behind the choices that you make. And so at a very pre-conventional level, our morality is basically like about self-interest. I'm going to do something to avoid being punished, or I'm going to do something to gain a reward. At a conventional level, it's more about the law and social rules. So I'm going to do something to gain social approval, or I'm going to avoid something so that I don't like have people think badly of me. So you've kind of moved from like an internal being punished or rewarded to like having others kind of punish or reward you, like how they think about you. And then lastly, at a post-conventional level, we talk about like abstract principles. And so we do things in order to adhere to our own like moral code and moral beliefs. So to give an example, the Heinz dilemma. This is a really common, really typically used example when discussing moral development. So just to summarize it, basically, there's a woman near death. She has a bad disease. It's some sort of cancer, and she needs to get a medicine from the pharmacist in the same town. The drug is expensive to make, but the pharmacist charges 10 times the price of what it actually costs. And so he only paid $200 for the drug, but he's charging people $2,000 for a dose of it. The sick woman's husband went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get about $1,000, which is half of what the drug costs. He tells the pharmacist his wife is dying. I need the drug. Please, I'll pay you back later. Give me the drug. The pharmacist says, nope, I'm going to make money from it, and I'm not going to give it to you unless you have the money. Heinz is desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. Should he have stolen the drug? Why or why not? Is he right or wrong? And so using Kohlberg's moral ladder, we can look at this dilemma. So was he right or wrong in stealing the drug? At a pre-conventional level, so this is at the most basic level of like authority and understanding morality, we would say yes, because you will save your wife and be a hero. And so you're gaining a reward by saving your wife. Or you could also say no, because remember, it's not the choice that you're making here, it's the reasoning behind the outcome. You could say no because you might get caught and go to jail. So you're concerned with like reward and punishment. That's what the pre-conventional level states. At a conventional level, then, you might say, yes, it was right to steal the drug because everyone in society is going to think you're a good husband. So it's all about how society views you. Or no, because everyone's going to think you're a criminal and a bad person. And then at the post-conventional level, this is a little bit trickier, but it's like your abstract principles of right and wrong. And so you might say that, yes, a person's right to life is more important than property. And so according to my own moral code and principles, I think that, yes, it's okay to steal the drug. So again, in studying Kohlberg, we're not studying for what the outcome is. We're studying for why the outcome, why the outcome is the way that it is. So just kind of keep that in mind. All right, we're moving back on now into Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. So all of those things kind of fit into that like puberty age range, so we kind of threw them there. So Erikson's next stage of development is identity versus role confusion. And this starts in your teens and continues on into your 20s. So this is the time period that most of you are in right now, or all of you are probably in right now. And it's all about like finding out, who am I? You test out different roles. Maybe you play sports or an instrument, or you really like to devote yourself to art or music or whatever. And so you try on all of these different roles and kind of figure out what hat fits you best. Who are you at your core? And so you put on all of these different roles and integrate them to form Susie's identity, or whatever your name is. If you struggle at this stage, you might become confused about who you are and have a crisis about like where you fit in and things like that. So the main task here is to kind of develop further who you are and continue that process into your 20s. Our identity, we may have different senses of self in different situations, right? You don't just wear like one role. Like, I'm a daughter, but I'm also a wife, and I'm also a teacher. And so I have all these different roles, and I act slightly different, right? In all of those roles, I have different identities that I play. Our group identities are often formed based on how we differ from those around us, which is sometimes why we see like bias and exclusion of certain people, because we identify as being like, let's say our friend group is all cheerleaders, and so that's how we identify ourselves, and so that's what sets us apart or makes us different from those around us, which then can lead to like exclusionary behaviors. This happens a lot with like race, when different groups like kind of like separate themselves from each other or don't let other people into their groups. We see that happen a lot. We live in a culture that is very individualistic, right? It's all about like, be yourself. You can be anything you want to be, right? We hear that a lot. And so I think that's important to understand, that not all societies are like that. In a lot of East Asian cultures, it's kind of the opposite. You want to focus more on like the collective good and the collective people. And so it's less about like, be your own person and like, be who we need you to be kind of idea. Those of us who develop a clearer self-identity are less prone to dangerous self-destructive behaviors because we want to be comfortable with who we are. Another interesting phase that is being like worked into psychology more and more is this idea of emerging adulthood. And so this didn't used to exist in psychological research, but in the last few years, it's really become a more common thing. And so basically it's this idea that like in modern cultures now, we become independent later, because so many of us now go to college and then maybe even move back in with our parents for a little bit. We aren't truly independent yet. And so instead of just going from like adolescence to adulthood, there's this like in-between period where like, yeah, you maybe live on your own when you're away at college, but you still depend on your parents for a lot. And so we still see not true independence until a little bit later. And so this is like a newer kind of psychological phenomenon. Once we've progressed then through our identity, we can start to develop intimate relationships with other people. And intimate doesn't mean like sexually intimate. It just means like a close, secure relationship with someone else, which it most likely is often with a sexual partner, like a partner that you date, but it could also be like a close friendship or something like that. And so this is from our 20s to our early 40s, and this is where we struggle to form a close relationship, gain the capacity for intimate love, and if we can't do those things, we may experience social isolation and like dislike for the world around us and feel like we don't fit in or we don't belong. And so we want to find those close, loving relationships to kind of move forward. After that stage, then we see generativity versus stagnation. And so this is from when you reach your 40s into your 60s. And this is when we discover our sense of like contributing to the world, either through the job that we do or through like raising our families. But we want to feel a sense of like accomplishment in our lives. We've done something, we're doing something to contribute, and we're not just like stagnant in the world around us. We want to feel a sense of purpose and feel meaningful in our lives. And then the last stage of development, according to Erikson, is age 60 and beyond. And so this is when we kind of reflect back on our lives. And do we feel a sense of integrity? Do we feel satisfied? Do we feel like we've lived our best lives and we're content and happy with what's happened? Or do we feel a sense of failure and despair because we've wasted our lives and we didn't do what we wanted to do? It's kind of a bummer stage if that happens. But hopefully we all, once we reach that age, can look back and feel that sense of accomplishment and that sense of security that we've lived a good life. And so now that we've reached like our adulthood, we still continue to see physical changes happening. Like I said, you don't just hit adulthood and then you're fully developed. So our physical abilities actually peak in our mid-20s. And so even though they peak in our mid-20s, it's not like, oh my gosh, you hit 40 and you've like gone down this deep decline. There's a slow, slight decline, but it's very almost imperceptible. It's very slow. The older you are, the more susceptible you become to life-threatening illnesses, so things like cancer and other big diseases. We actually, though, get a better immune system, and so we less often get things like the cold and the flu because our bodies have built up a resistance to that over time. As we age, we also get a slower neural processing. So basically, we just need more time to react, to solve puzzles, to think creatively, remember new names, things like that. And so we do see that brain regions important to memory and inhibition start to atrophy or degenerate over time. And again, this is like not happening super often in people's like 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's like a very slight, slow decline over time. I think these charts, though, are interesting to look at. And so this is just showing the portion of people who see like 20/20 vision or hear the correct word or identify the correct smell. And so you can see that like vision remains pretty stable until you reach about age 70, and then there's like a pretty good decline. Hearing does start to decline a little bit more swiftly, starting around age maybe 40 or mid-30s or so. And then smell is more stable again over into your 70s. And so it really depends on the sense and it really depends on the person, but you can just kind of see the physical changes that occur based on age range there. We also experience cognitive changes in adulthood. So our crystallized intelligence continues to grow throughout our lifespan. And crystallized intelligence just refers to all of these things that we've accumulated over time with knowledge. So my vocabulary is always getting bigger and bigger. I learn new words. My accumulated knowledge about the world is getting bigger and bigger. This gets increases with age, and it's just like our standard kind of knowledge base. Fluid intelligence, though, is our ability to like problem solve and react quickly and reason speedily and abstractly. And so this does decline as we get older. So typically if we like put a 70-year-old and a 40-year-old down and had them like solve a problem, the 40-year-old would solve it quicker. And it's just something because your neural speed slows down, you have a harder time like thinking outside the box and solving those problems. This is just showing kind of that example that we just talked about. So the number of words recognized is stable with age. So like our vocabulary test is represented by that red line. That's pretty stable. But if I asked you to recall a list of words that I read, you can see that that gets a lot more difficult as we see people getting older and older. And so there's a decline in that like fluid or remembering new information type intelligence. So how do we study these things? And so this is probably one of the bigger or more important things to know from this unit. And this is the last thing we're going to talk about tonight. But basically, we do two types of studies to kind of study the age span and age range. A cross-sectional study is when we would take people of different ages and compare them to one another. So if I'm trying to like figure out vocabulary, I might take an 80-year-old, a 60-year-old, a 40-year-old, and a 20-year-old and compare their vocabulary. That's a cross-sectional study. I'm comparing people of various ages. And when I do that, I see that older adults give fewer correct answers than younger adults. And so I might come to the conclusion then that there's a decline of mental ability with age, and that's just part of aging. So according to the cross-sectional method, I might see that. However, if I do a longitudinal study on that same information, a longitudinal study says or shows me when I take the same people and restudy them over years. So it's a long-term study. I might study someone at the age of 30 and then 40 and then 50 and then 60. And so as I'm retesting these people, that blue line there represents that there's not actually a decline. And so I'm testing the same exact information, and I'm seeing in one study that there's a cognitive decline, and in the other study, I'm not. So how am I getting this conflicting information when I'm studying the exact same thing? And so it's important when we're reading about studies to look at the methodology behind them, because a cross-sectional study is not just comparing two age groups, but it's comparing two generations. So right now, if we were studying 70-year-olds and 30-year-olds, we're studying 70-year-olds who didn't grow up with the internet and all this technology and all these advancements that we've had. And so we're kind of comparing apples to oranges in that scenario. People born in the early 1900s had bigger families. They're less affluent and less educated. So again, we're not comparing the same thing when we're studying people from two generations. However, longitudinal studies also have problems. A longitudinal study is problematic because if like people die throughout the study, then we're losing part of our group. And maybe those people that die for reasons because like they have poor health care and poor things like that. And so that can lead us to having skewed results in our study as well. So in any sort of like long-term like span about age, or we're studying different age groups and things like that, it's important for us to look at whether it's longitudinal or cross-sectional to truly understand what the evidence, if it could be misleading, basically, if it's telling the whole story, or if we could think about it critically, why the information could be differed. So that is all I have for you guys tonight. Like I said, the development unit's pretty big. We didn't get a chance to do a ton of review, but we will next week. I'll have an FRQ and some multiple choice questions, and then we'll jump into the kind of psychological misconceptions. So if you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me on the Facebook page. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Bye.